Virgin blood.
Before Twilight, it was the 80s that introduced us to teen vampires with the likes of The Lost Boys and Fright Night. You also, of course, had these kind of sex comedies that were coming out in the 80s in force as well. So inevitably we got some crossover, and we had a few kind of horny guy teenage vampire movies, and this is one of them in Teen Vampire, directed and written by Samuel Bradford. It's a 1989 movie that stars Gulager, although he is only in a small supporting role. It's a seemingly very low budget movie that apparently takes place in the 1950s, although it doesn't explicitly say so, and there are some inconsistencies with that kind of time frame, but whatever. So what is the story? It focuses on this teenager called Murphy, who is your typical kind of like nerd, you know, picked upon by the school bully, likes a girl from afar, etc., a bit of a wallflower. And him and his kind of clueless friend one day decide they're going to go and try and pop their cherry with a prostitute. However, this prostitute seems to be a vampire and turns Murphy into a vampire himself, which of course makes him cool, confident, as well as being an actual kind of blood-sucking fiend. Now, inevitably, more people get kind of turned into vampires, and what'll happen? Well, you'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss. This is a seemingly very low budget movie from what you can see on screen here. It's not a highly polished movie. Can we say anything in the plus column? This being a kind of comedy, clearly it's trying to have a few jokes in here, and I think one or two do actually kind of quite work. For example, they don't have any garlic in their house. This kind of the mother, Murphy's mother, and this kind of reverend played by Gulager. So they try to use onions instead because they think it's kind of close enough. So things like this, I think, were quite a fun little kind of like gag. And the reverend played by Gulager is actually quite a kind of a fun character. You know, shocked to discover vampires are real and trying to kind of learn how to kind of try and defeat them. He essentially plays kind of like a Van Helsing kind of style character in the end. So that was kind of quite a fun performance from him, I have to say. Despite this clearly being a very low budget film, I kind of like the look of the vampires. I mean, it's relatively basic, but I think it kind of works. It's kind of white contact lenses, fangs, etc., slightly kind of like made out kind of white faces and stuff like that. Now, I think sometimes the temptation is to go a little bit over the top with the vampires, but I think there is clearly kind of obviously changes that happens, but it does make the vampires look relatively menacing. And for a kind of a horror comedy, I actually thought they did a good job here of making the vampires actually look fairly kind of menacing with the kind of the limited budget that they clearly kind of had. We do end up getting a few vampires, and yeah, some of the effects are laughable. These vampires seem to be able to teleport for no kind of apparent reason, but you know, there you go. It's still, I quite enjoyed the kind of the makeup here. And there are a few kind of likeable moments. I mean, the guy that they've got to play this kind of teenager, when we see him at the beginning of the movie, he's clearly got like a 5 o'clock shadow and everything. So, but nonetheless, there is still some kind of like quite fun and entertaining kind of moments in the movie, at least spotted out here and there. But let's talk about what doesn't work. The main problem with this movie, I think, is an inexperienced director and a clearly low budget and very, I have to say, amateurish production. There are scenes here that look like they've just been filmed off the fly with a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing. It really does feel like just kind of like chaos captured on screen. I've rarely seen a amateurish effort like this put out on a kind of a mainstream as a mainstream movie, certainly in the 80s.
What happened to you?
It's not all the movie, but there are some sequences here that just feel unbelievably amateurish. In the way that they've kind of been produced, the lack of kind of technical finesse in there, the actors who clearly don't know what they're doing half the time. It's a bit of a poorly put together movie on a on a technical basis. The editing isn't particularly kind of strong. And I have to say the flow of the movie is really inconsistent because it just grinds to a halt on certain times and nothing seems to be kind of happening. There's extended sequences with characters who seem to have little or no impact on the actual kind of story itself. So it kind of makes it a dull movie with only kind of sporadically kind of like peppered scenes throughout. There are a few things that I quite enjoy, but for the most part this movie is quite dull, and it kind of starts out reasonable. It kind of, you almost feeling like it's kind of a Christine kind of style movie when it's kind of setting up, but it kind of, the facade falls apart after a kind of 10 minutes or so into the kind of the film. It's an 80s horror comedy. The performances are kind of hokey, but you kind of expect that. The vampire lore here is a little bit kind of like fast and loose. As they say, these vampires seem to teleport. They seem to be able to be killed with a stake through the stomach rather than kind of the heart. So yeah, it's kind of playing fast and loose with kind of vampire mythology, and there's very little explanation about why this happened, who the kind of the vampire prostitute is, and what her lineage or anything like that. She's just there to kind of get this guy, transformed into a vampire, and then we don't kind of really see her a hell of a lot, to be honest. So it's kind of like, it's just a kind of a way to kind of get the story going. The movie does have a few funny jokes, but for the most part I've got to say that the humour kind of falls a little flat, and some of the characters just seem a little bit kind of, not funny, to put it brutally. There's also a real kind of lack of any real horror in this movie, outside of, I think, of some relatively effective moments in regards to the makeup. But, people just seem very nonplussed when they kind of see a vampire get turned into a vampire or witness something like that. It doesn't really seem all that. It's like it's trying to be particularly kind of like horror or scary or anything like that. And the jokes are kind of like few and far between as well. So it doesn't really work on either level. Outside of a few moments which I do think were either funny or well put together, but they are few and far between, and for the most part this is a very amateurish effort. I'll give it a 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.